Okay, thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for being out on this chilly, but not as chilly as it could have been, January morning. And what I want to do is build on what you have just heard from all of our introductory speakers and fill in some of those gaps. And let's see if I can... I've got too many buttons up here. So in the process of giving thank yous, oftentimes thanking the people who actually helped put the work gets left for last and skipped over when I'm running over. So I just wanted to thank, I'm going to use the pointer, which is white, which may not show up very much, but this way it'll show up on all three screens. And if I use the laser pointer, only the people up here get to see what I'm pointing to. The work I'm going to talk about couldn't have been done without the assistance of some wonderful students and my colleagues at Northwestern University and other colleagues at the University of Chicago and Minnesota, and then the collaborators that I've built here around Chicago, the Nature, Culture, and Human Health group. It's a working group that I'll give you some contact information at the end. And then the funding, because somebody has to pay for all of this, comes from the Forest Preserves of Cook County, the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern, the Conservation Foundation, I'm not sure if I don't think it's this group, it's another foundation, or the TCF Foundation via Mark Berman, and the Nagani Foundation. So, giving you an overview of where I'm going to go with this talk is that I'm going to start by delving a little bit more to the health benefits of nature, which you've heard a little bit about. I could potentially just say, oh, you saw all the slides earlier, let's just stick with that, but I'm going to dig into that a bit. And also talk about the types of research that have been done and what's supporting this information. Then I'm going to give you an example of some of my own research, which looks at how nature might actually help us combat and overcome the obesity and diabetes epidemic because of the strong relationship between stress and the environment. Then I want to build on that information to talk about why the public health community and conservation communities need each other. Because by working together, we can try to build a coalition to both support conservation and promote better public health. So, you've seen some of these before, but what is happening and what you've seen in the public press, or the popular press in the last few years, is a burgeoning number of popular press articles and books. Classic of this is now The Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, coined the term nature deficit disorder. And a recent book, which is a really lovely book, I recommend everybody grab a copy of it, by Florence Williams, called The Nature Fix. It came out last spring. The Japanese have been a leader in this area of research, starting back in the 80s. And they have actually coined a term called Shinrin-yoku. This term, Shinrin-yoku, translates broadly as to forest bathing. And what this means is going out to the forest and engaging the forest with your entire... Okay, sorry. It sounds really loud to me up here already. Going out into the forest and engaging with all of your senses. And it's not just a matter of getting exercise out there, it's actually paying attention, it's smelling, it's hearing. It's all five senses. So, just to give you an example of how rapidly the scientific research into this is building, and as Brooke mentioned earlier, we all know that it feels this good, or it feels good to be out in nature and we enjoy being out there. But if you're going to build policy on that feeling, you're going to have a hard time sometimes convincing politicians and policymakers to spend $1 million to build a new park on it. So if you have some scientific data, you can use that to help build your policy. And the scientific data in the peer-reviewed literature is growing. And this is just a bar graph showing how many papers that I've found for every 5-year period just using a search that used the words forest bathing. So this is a very small proportion of the literature, but it gives you a sense of the rapidity with which the field is growing. And that back well, you can't see my hand waving at that. Back in the 90s, there were 1 or 2 papers a year coming out, maybe less. But by 2015, we're looking at 35 or more papers. And I can tell you there are many, many more coming out. And so this is definitely a growing field, and it's very, very much in the scientific community's interest from many levels, from psychology to public health to landscape architecture and urban planning. Howard Frumkin and his colleagues, Howard's a health psychologist, public health scientist at the University of Washington, recently reviewed the literature and presented a argument and agenda for research in this area. And as part of their paper, what they did was summarize the scope of research on health benefits of nature. And what I want to point out is that research on health benefits of nature covers a wide range of both spatial scales, from very small scale, including spending time with potted plants and the activity of actually potting plants, to going out on wilderness adventures, backpacking trips, whitewater rafting trips. But these are things that happen only occasionally, and they've been met. And some of the interventions are looking at just a single day or a single period of activity and seeing changes in mental health and states as a result of those activities. However, at the other end of the scale, we can see what happens when you live in a green neighborhood. So we can think of that as a medium spatial scale with what is in our neighborhoods and how much time we're spending, and that's sort of an ongoing, we're not really actively thinking about going out and spending time in nature, but it's a passive engagement with nature because it's where we live. So, let's think about health. For many people, thinking about health means thinking about the opposite of disease or injury. But there is a much broader context for health. And this is laid out in the preamble to the Constitution to the World Health Organization. And it's really important as we think about the role of nature in health to put this in that broader context, to put health in that broader context. And that is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So we're talking about well-being. And that well-being means we're talking about our communities and our social environment and preventative medicine. So how does this fit with the health benefits of nature? The scope of that research on the health benefits of nature encompasses both benefits to individuals and benefits to communities. And examples, and some of which you've already heard, for example, are the psychological benefits to individuals include increases in concentration, improvements in mood, and decreases in stress. On the physical benefits, we see decreases in blood pressure, a lower incidence of migraine headaches, and a reduction in blood glucose, which is a measure and an indicator of type 2 or diabetes, whether it's type 2 or type 1. In terms of social interactions, the availability of green space, green landscaping in neighborhoods and things lead to greater time spent outdoors playing by children, greater use of common spaces by adults and all people in the neighborhood, and this contributes to the building of stronger neighborhood ties and stronger communities. Other very classic work that was actually done in Chicago by Bill Sullivan and Ming Kuo at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign points to reductions in incivilities. They observed reductions in aggression, reductions in violence, and a reduction in the fear felt by residents in the old public housing complexes of the Robert Taylor homes and the Ida B. Wells homes. So there is a lot going on and many benefits, both community and to the individual. So what I want to talk about is now, how do you connect nature to those physical health, or to those various health benefits? And that's the area in which I am doing my research, and that's trying to understand what the underlying mechanisms are. And in the literature on health benefits of nature, and this literature can also be found to some degree by looking for eco-psychology, but we needed a new name for this field because it's not just psychology, it includes physiology, and ecophysiology means something completely else. So if it has a good name for what we want to call this burgeoning field, let me know. But the four major hypotheses are obviously physical activity. You know, if there's green space, you're more likely to have the opportunity to get out and be physically active. But it's not just physical activity. There are two psychological bases. One is attention restoration. This has to do with the fact that we use energy and neural resources to pay attention to our tedious, dull, everyday work. And what has been found is that when you spend time outside, your brain relaxes, and the pathways that have been working so hard to keep you focused can relax. And that's why it's called an attention restoration hypothesis, because it means you are restored, you can come back and go back to work. The stress reduction hypothesis is based on the biophilic design, or biophilia hypothesis of Edward E.O. Wilson. And I'm forgetting his name, it begins with a K, that's ridiculous. Anyway, anyway, it's the stress reduction hypothesis, and that is based on the idea that humans evolved in nature. And therefore, our urban environments are not our natural habitat. And if you think of what happens to wild animals when you take them out of their natural habitat, they get stressed. Think of the old-style zoos where animals were in cages, and that lion, maybe that cougar who's out there at the paced back and forth in sort of stereotypical stress behavior. Well, perhaps that's what we as humans are doing when we remove ourselves from nature. And by going back out in nature, we place ourselves back in our natural environment, we feel calmer and more relaxed. And then the fourth hypothesis focuses on the community benefits, and that is investigated under the rubric of a community cohesion, that all of that benefits of being able to get outside and interact with people, you form connections and networks with your neighbors, and that helps reduce incivilities. So, there's a lot involved in those four hypotheses. And as a scientist, particularly somebody who spent 25 or more years of my career delving down into cellular and molecular pathways about how estrogen influences a single ion channel, we're not going to go there. We want to think about how, if nature is therapy, what are the mechanisms? What are the physiological, what are the psychological mechanisms? Because that's how we build an evidence base. So if nature is therapy, we need to think about providing evidence in some very specific areas. And for those of you in the public health field, you'll recognize this as being very similar to what you have to do in the evidence-based practice protocol. So we have to ask, what is the correct exposure? Is it that single-potted plant? Can you get it by looking at a video screen that has pictures of nature on it? Is it smelling it? Is it seeing it? Is it the bird song? What is it? Also, what are the outcome results? If you're going to build public health policy on something, the policymakers are going to want to know what is the health problem we're trying to address. Are we trying to reduce diabetes? Are we trying to address asthma? So we need to be specific about what are the specific health causes or outcomes that we want to affect. Who benefits? The idea that the same exposure to nature is going to benefit the same, everybody in exactly the same way is a false idea. There are ethnic and cultural differences in how people engage with nature. If you grew up in the inner city, the way you're going to respond when you come out to a forest preserve, especially if you're confronted with the idea, oh my God, there's a cougar out there, it's going to be very different than the way I'm going to respond having grown up in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains north of Seattle. It's like, oh, good, let me go find that. And also gender and age can influence these things. So we need to be specific about who's benefiting and who are we talking to. And finally, we want to ask, in what ways do healthy landscapes relate to healthy people? And this gets us to the question of what is nature? Does it have to be more than a potted plant? Do you have to go on that whitewater experience? So what is it? And also, what about the quality of nature? Does it have to be a pristine and biodiverse environment? The video earlier showed, had a little subtitle that says "Golf is not nature." So, is that lawn of Kentucky bluegrass nature? Is turf nature? So those are a lot of the types of questions. So now that sort of finishes my first component of this talk of looking at the overview of the health benefits of nature and some of the gaps in our knowledge about health benefits of nature. Now I'm going to delve into my research on the relationship between nature, obesity, and diabetes. And I'm going to come at that from the idea that stress and the structure of our environment may actually be contributing to the diabetes epidemic. These are some recent data from the Centers for Disease Control, and what they show is the prevalence of obesity, but not diabetes. This is obesity in the United States by state and territory. And the darker the colors, the darker the color, the higher the incidence of obesity. And what we're talking about in these dark red states is over 35% of the population suffering from diabetes or suffering from obesity. And this is not good because, and I keep alluding to diabetes in here, obesity is the primary risk factor for type 2 diabetes, for cardiovascular disease, and a host of other diseases, chronic diseases. Essentially, these chronic psychosocial diseases are now the leading cause of morbidity in the United States. It's not infectious diseases anymore. We got infectious diseases under control. What we have to deal with are lifestyle diseases. And starting with the obesity epidemic is stage 1. So this is the way I think about the relationship between our physical state, our body mass index, and when your body mass index is over 30, and the arguments right now are whether President Trump at 29.9 is he obese or is he not? And you're a quarter of an inch short and he'd be obese. And our metabolic health. And with metabolic health, I think you have all of the signaling that contribute to type 2 diabetes. So obviously, what we eat and how much physical activity we get are going to be significant contributors at the individual level. How we behave in terms of food and activity are going to be very important. But what gets missed a lot is the idea of chronic stress. Stress causes changes in our hormones, it causes changes in our neurotransmitters, and it causes changes in our immune system. Those 3 types of chemical messengers are responsible for coordinating the activities of the 32 billion cells in your body. When those chemical messenger signals change, our bodies do weird things. And so when we're chronically stressed, what that can do is change what we eat. How many of you grabbed a Snickers bar the last time you were stressed and upset about something, or that hot fudge sundae looks really great? Comfort food. That's not just because you're weak. That's because your brain is telling you to go for carbohydrates and fat. The other thing is when you are stressed, many of us have a healthy response of going out and getting physical activity because we know if we're active, it'll make us feel better. But if you're stressed, you're more likely to, particularly chronically stressed, to reduce your activity levels. All of these things feed into what happens with our health and our body mass and metabolic health. So how does this fit in with the environment? Well, our social environment contributes a great deal. You know, we eat socially. We're more likely to go get physical activity if we have an activity buddy. But our social interactions also contribute to the presence or absence of chronic stress, family relationships, and all those sorts of things. But also the physical environment contributes. We've heard a lot about the idea of food deserts, or the absence of healthy food sources in grocery stores in certain neighborhoods. But the case I'm going to make today is that another component of that physical environment that helps us reduce chronic stress is the presence of green space. So, what is stress? Stress is our body's response to a demand or a threat. We need the stress response. The stress response is those changes in hormones, neurotransmitters, and immune chemicals that coordinate our body's activity. And we need that response because we confront acute stress every day. Even the process of getting out of bed in the morning is a stress. And if I measured your cortisol levels, which are a stress hormone, in the 30 minutes after you get out of bed, your stress hormone levels are going to double or triple with the cortisol. And that's a normal response. That's called the cortisol awakening response. But in evolutionary time, the acute stress response was present to help us survive and protect us from environmental threats. You know, it's the fight-flight response. If you see that cougar, you're going to run. The other thing is nowadays that stress response is responsible for helping liberate energy when you need to go out and run a marathon, or just as I go for a slow walk with the dog. But also it increases blood pressure and oxygenation. So, you know, it's a good thing. It helps us go through our daily life. However, there's another form of the stress response that is not so good for us, and that is chronic stress. Think of the difference between acute and chronic stress as wearing a bad pair of shoes. You know, the acute stress is where you put those shoes on, they rub on your heel, and you say, oh, I'm getting out of here, and you take them off in a minute, and you're done with it. Chronic stress is when, oh, I've got an 8-hour business meeting, I'm on my feet, and these are the only shoes I've got, and by the end of that day, you've got calluses, blisters, and you're miserable. So what I'm going to talk about is chronic stress. And in evolutionary times, the primary form of chronic stress for humans was famine. What happens is those same hormones, neurotransmitters, and immune chemicals that are responsible for our acute stress response, when they are present for days and hours, or days and weeks and months, our body goes into a starvation response to save energy. Because if you could survive the famine, you would live. I have a friend who is a weight loss counselor, and she and I both trained as evolutionary biologists initially, and her response to her patients when they come in is not to chide them for being overweight or for not watching their diet, but to say, congratulations, you're a survivor. You would have survived the famine. Now we have to deal with that famine response in the context of chronic stress in modern times where there is a lot of food available. And instead of famine being the problem, what we're looking at in chronic stress is the existence of poverty, illness, loss of homes, everything. Worried about what's happening at your job, whether you're getting along with your colleagues. So all of these contribute. But when we've got all the food in the world, and lots of it is high calorie and high fat and high carbohydrates, it can contribute to our obesity epidemic. So my contention is that the stress response also contributes to these obesity problems. So what does nature have to do with this? Okay, going back to thinking about this, this is where my research focuses, is can spending time in nature reduce stress, improve our metabolic status, and help us deal with the obesity epidemic? So what we do and don't know about nature, obesity, and type 2 diabetes can be summarized in about 11 papers that have already been published. One looked at people with type 2 diabetes who took a walk who took a walk in a forest. And the researchers measured their blood glucose before and after taking a walk, and lo and behold, after they took a walk, their blood glucose levels were lower. Okay, that's great. But if you took a walk anyplace, you would expect your blood glucose levels to be lower. The other 10 papers focus on what happens in people residing in a neighborhood. And these are data in the realm of epidemiological results. And people who live in green neighborhoods, when you correct for age, gender, socioeconomic status, and a whole host of other things, just living in a green neighborhood results in people having lower BMIs, lower obesity, and lower incidence of type 2 diabetes. So where my work fits is in this middle, in this scope, is trying to connect, does actually taking a walk and getting reduced blood glucose levels provide a mechanism for long-term weight loss and improvements in blood glucose. And so what I'm trying to do is essentially look at what dose of exercise and where do you do it doesn't matter in terms of your weight loss program. So the data I'm going to present today are from a study we call Walking Green. And the objectives of that study are, primarily it's a pilot study, because no one has ever tried to connect both psychological and physiological data. So it's relatively short term. But it is a longitudinal study, and it was funded, I'm going to explain the design a little bit more on the next slide, and it was funded in part by the Forest Preserves of Cook County as part of their Next Century Conservation Plan initiative. The population we recruited were healthy males and females between the ages of 18 and 35, and I want to emphasize that we were recruiting healthy people for this study. So the whole study, well, it took over a year and a half to collect all the data, but for each individual person, they were enrolled in the study for 29 days. And on the first day, they came in and gave informed consent. And then they were assigned to walk either on a forest side, or a forest trail, or on a sidewalk. And this was designed as a crossover design experiment. So the way it started out was half the people started out walking on a sidewalk, half on the forest. They took 3 walks in each location, then they took a week off, and then came back and walked 3 walks in the opposite location. So on 2 days of each of those walks, they came in and did health assessments. So on Mondays, they came in fasting, so we could measure fasting blood glucose, and they did a battery of psychological tests. Then they went out for their walk, and when they came back, they did another battery of psychological tests. The other thing is that on the days that they didn't walk, on these off days, so essentially if they finished their last walk on Friday, they came back in on Monday morning, and they did another round of health assessments. They left the lab after doing the first part of the walk, left for 2 hours, went about their daily activities of living, and then came back into the lab and did it all over again. So we've got before and after, and for each of these health assessments that I'm talking about, we're talking about from the time they came into the lab, gave their blood test, had breakfast, went out for their walk, came back and left the lab, about a period of 4 hours. So this is a major time commitment on the part of these people. Anything we do in the future will not be that crazy. But it gave us a lot of data and a lot of things to think about. So where did we do this? Well, my lab is here in Evanston, on this sort of off campus at Northwestern University. Everyone came into the lab, did their health assessment, and then we drove them out to Harms Woods. So it's about a 6-mile drive that on average took 20 minutes. And I tried to take people, one sidewalk and one forest walker in the car at each time. That way they were subjected to the same amount of stress of sitting in a car with me driving in traffic. And so once we arrived at Harms Woods, we did some blood pressure measurements in the parking lot, and then the forest walk group went out for a lovely walk with views like this in Harms Woods. The people walking on the sidewalk went off on Old Orchard Road and got views like that. So the first sets of data that I want to show you are assessments of psychological state, just because we want to baseline our data to previous studies that show improvements in mental health. So what I want to show you is these are the results for the a test called the PANAS, or the Positive and Negative Affect Scale. And what this measures is there are a suite of questions that say, how positive is your mood? Sort of what kind of a good mood are you in, and a negative affect, so indicators of being in a bad mood. So what happens when people went out on those days when they didn't walk, when they came to the lab, left, and came back? So essentially we're looking at the impact of going about your daily activities of life. And for the positive affect scale, what this means is the changes were negative, which means their mood is getting worse. And similarly, for the negative indicators, they increase. Again, you're getting worse. So just going about your daily life, by the, over the change of about 4 hours, you're in a worse mood than when you started. When we look on the sidewalk, what we see is that there is a slight improvement in mood. Both the positive affects improve and the negative indicators decrease. So even going for a walk on the sidewalk improve people's moods. But look what happens when they walk in the forest. There is a much greater improvement in the indicators for mood when you walk in the forest. Now let's take a look at two other indicators of mental health. Your anxiety and your perceived stress. Both of these scales change in the same direction, with being deflections, upward, indicating worse states. When you go out, over the course of a day, your anxiety goes up. There wasn't much change in perceived stress. However, when you go out for that walk on the sidewalk, you could say walking on the sidewalk might be a little bit better because your anxiety at least doesn't go up. But what's happening with your perceived stress is it's going up. People are more stressed when they walk on the sidewalk. However, when they walk in the forest, their anxiety levels go down, and they go down to a greater degree than when they walk on the sidewalk. And when they walk in the forest, their perceived stress levels go down. Okay. So I need to wrap up. Or get moving. Not wrap up, but. Okay, so the next thing is I want to look at those blood glucose levels. So blood glucose gives us what we're looking at is the change in blood glucose from the first day they come in to the following Monday. So they're taking a 72-hour break between the last walk and the time they come back into the lab. So this is telling us, is there a persistent effect of walking on your blood glucose levels? What these numbers mean is that healthy levels run in the 70 to 100, pre-diabetes is 120 to 100 to 125, and if you've got over 140 milligrams per deciliter, we're talking about pre-diabetes. So, the levels when people were in the lab on the first day, I emphasized that the people who were recruited for the study were healthy. But we had a lot of people who had some fairly high blood glucose levels. That gave us the opportunity to look for a little bit of change, but when they walked on the sidewalk, there was no change in anything. There's a slight increase when you look at the paired comparisons. But when you look on the forest walks, there's actually a decrease in blood glucose. I want to caution that these data are not statistically significant, and probably the reason that is true is because we worked with healthy people. We didn't have that many people who had high levels, but the next study we're going to do, we're recruiting people with symptoms of prediabetes and the early phases of type 2 diabetes. So the next one is, do any of these things affect change in attitudes about nature? So we gave a test that was called the Nature Relatedness Scale, and lo and behold, yes, when you go out for a walk in nature, people, just by walking in nature, show a greater interest in connectedness to nature. We didn't teach them anything, but that's it. So taking a walk in the woods is what you want to do. It's good for you. Do it in the woods rather than on the sidewalk. So now, summarizing and thinking about changing behavior, why should public health and conservation communities work together? Well, conservationists are really good about talking about ecosystem services. And we know that ecosystem services are essential to helping public health through provisioning, by regulating temperature. But there's another level at which the conservation and public health community can work together, and that is looking at the community and socioeconomic health and the individual physical and mental health. And that there is a two-way street between public health and conservation. And if any of you have had your budget cut during a recession, one of the first places to lose money is the conservation and parks and recreation community. So by working together, we may be better able to build arguments for why those budgets need to be maintained. So in terms of getting people outside to work, most Americans report being concerned about the environment. 75% say they are concerned. But of that, only about 20 people act on their concerns all of the time. A few people act, or 63% work, or act on those interests. So how can we leverage getting people outside to improve their health into conservation action? Well, people who spend time outdoors are more likely to engage in conservation activities. So we need to get them out. But we do have a problem, is that there's a big disparity both by ethnicity and age. So we have to think about how to engage people of different ethnicities and ages. And the main reason people give for not being outdoors is they're simply not interested. So what can we do to increase interest in spending time outside? Well, the published literature tells us teaching people about nature, nature-based education, but surprisingly also just introducing people to nature art, having arts programs, writing programs, arts and humanities, and get them outside and take them for a walk. So with that, what I want to build, or what I hope I've done, is build a case that by educating people about the health benefits of nature we can combat and deal with national and regional health issues, and using that, build a case for a strong and diverse conservation constituency. And if you want to connect with us, here's all my contact. Thank you.